Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you with us. The topic for today follows an in-person event that we did a couple of months ago. And we had such an interesting discussion in relation to this particular topic in a room with about 8 or so marketers. And it felt unfair that we didn't take that opportunity to our wider audience. And we're excited to have folks from New Zealand with us today and obviously across Australia, and some into Asia as well. So thank you for making the time to be with us. So let's jump in and have a look at the agenda to get the ball rolling. This particular series falls under a branding that we liked, which is called The Art of What's Possible. The catchline there is, or the phrase line is, marketing automation for the rest of us. So we're not talking platforms necessarily. We're really just looking at marketing automation for marketers today and some of the key challenges and experiences that we're all trying to deliver. And certainly this concept of privacy is paramount at the moment, and there's been lots happening over the last few years for us to be aware of. So what we want to do is look, first of all, exploring the paradox that is, consumer expectation versus the data that is offered. We'll then look at the GDPR. So for those, most of you, I'm sure, probably be aware of the European Union's laws and legislations around privacy. It's called the GDPR. Can we expect that to come down south? And by down south, I'm talking Asia, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So we'll explore that and have a look at maybe some of the lessons that we can learn from GDPR that might help us to prepare for what might eventually happen. And it's looking like it will eventually happen. Data and privacy challenges faced by marketers today. So we'll spend most of our time there, and that's where we'll then jump into the roundtable discussion to talk a little bit more about that. So who's with us today? So we're thrilled to have Andrew Birmingham, who's the Group Managing Editor with Next Media, with us. And Andrew's focus is on B2B. You'll notice there in his job title. Andrew's also the former Associate Publisher of the Australian Financial Review, where he was also a contributing editor. And as General Manager, Channel Development at the Fin Review Group, he led the relaunch of AFR.com, which some of you might remember. During his career, he's reported on the Australian ICT and related sectors for over 30 years. In addition to the AFR, his prior editorial credits also include the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, Computer World, CIO, B&T, and My Business. He also held roles as Deputy Managing Editor, CIO, and COO for IDG Communications. So he's a keen student of all things CX, and with that experience, we're thrilled to have him with us. So Andrew, thank you for making some time to be with us today. We've also got Adrian Jones on the line, who's our CEO and co-founder here at Marketing Cube, and myself, Derek Bell. I'll be sort of playing host today and covering a couple of points as well. So we will get to a sort of a roundtable type of discussion. So I really would encourage you, if you had a chance to look at those housekeeping slides, to access the Q&A function. The Q&A function is public, so any questions you ask there will be seen by everybody, but you can also upvote. So if somebody's already asked a question that you'd like asked, just go ahead and upvote it, and we'll push that one to the top of the line. But let's jump in, and Adrian, at this point, I might hand over to you to jump into this first point.
Sure. Thanks, Derek. We wanted to just, set a bit of a background to this and start, I think, by spending a few minutes just exploring this consumer experience data paradox. So it goes something like, I expect highly personalized customer experiences, but I don't want to share any of my personal information. So that really is kind of that's our challenge. And if we look back at this quote here from 2019, Gartner was predicting that 80% of marketers would abandon all personalization efforts by 2025. So why? So I think it's because on the one hand, we've got consumers being wary about who they give their personal data to. They're concerned about data breaches and what companies might do with the data that they share. And then governments are starting to take some action on this. So they're looking to curtail the power of kind of big tech companies and start to help to protect consumers. And then you've got technology companies that are also doing the same thing. So Apple are making changes, and Facebook and Google, even your mobile phones are telling you how you can enhance your privacy features and, more choice about who you give the data to and whether that app really still needs to continue to have access to your location, for example. And, this all leads to transparency, which is great, and to give you more control over your data, but it also gives consumers this heightened awareness of this data and the fact that they have this data and the fact that they're sharing this data with people. So, and that's sort of, they're closing that down slowly, and people are sort of saying, I don't want to share that amount of information. But on the other hand, you've got this constant drive for more personalization. So consumers are demanding more and more personalization. And McKinsey here saying that, personalization could generate 40% more revenue and generate over $1 trillion in value. So it's critical to growth. And, when you think about it, everybody wants personalized, relevant, digital and customer experiences. We want less irrelevant emails. We want less irrelevant ads. We want less noise. And then we want things to be as easy as possible so that we can get things done. So we want simplicity. We want seamlessness. We want frictionlessness. We expect brands to know us, and we don't like being asked the same question over and over again, especially when we're not really sure why they need that information. And then we want companies to be up to date with how they're interacting with us kind of across their whole organization. So I expect my digital journey to transition to my sales conversation and my preferences to be respected. So there's a lot of the kind of requirements in that personalization space, but then underlyingly, the consumers are becoming more and more aware. So that transparency driving awareness, data breaches driving awareness, and that changing legislation that we keep hearing about, the end of third-party cookies. And I think it applies, equally B2B and B2C. So business customers are looking to get educated so that they don't make bad decisions. And the educator is often like their trusted advisor, and that trust leads to the opportunity. And so that trust becomes really important. So before we move on, I think what we might do is just have a quick look at some of the data and definitions that we'll use. So in the context of today's discussion, we're talking about personalization. And that is it's a really broad term. And so we're encompassing all personalized experiences across the customer journey today, from paid media and ads right at the beginning through personalization, through marketing, the sales cycle, and customer service. So it's a really broad topic. But when it comes to the data definitions, just in case kind of people aren't clear on these, the labels actually refer to the entity that's collecting the data, as in I collect, you collect, or they collect. So first party data relates to that entity that collects the data, not the type of data that they're collecting. So I collect, for example, website data and email activity and purchase history. That zero party data is actually, that's a term relatively recently coined by Forrester, and it's a subset really of the first party data, which is actively and intentionally given data. So you'll see that in things like data from a form or a preference center, and it's often commonly associated with personally identifiable information, kind of your PII data. So that's part of your first party data, really. Second party data is a little bit more kind of ambiguous, but it's data collected directly by someone and shared with you as a trusted partner. So could be something like LinkedIn sign-on, where you've given permission to share your data when you use LinkedIn to fill in a form, or part of, say, a sponsorship package at an event where you might say, okay, well, we're going to give the sponsors all the names of the attendees and the companies, and they're directly collecting that information and sharing it with the sponsor as a trusted partner, and hopefully everyone's informed along the way that that's going to happen. And then third-party data is collected and collated by third parties and includes things like cookies and data collection via ad tech, tracking pixels and things like third-party cookies. So they're all the sorts of different types of data, if you like, and it'll help a little bit. But let's have a dive into the regulations and see what insights there are there.
Yeah. In the context of this discussion, we thought it would be worthwhile to jump back and have a look at what our European friends have kind of been up to. And it's a few years into GDPR now. And what's been the impact, essentially? So extensive Googling, I won't call it research, it was Googling, to come up with some information. And One really interesting piece of documentation I found was from the University College London, and it was a report that had been tabled by these three gentlemen. It's not bedtime reading, I can assure you. The thing about it, this document that differed to everything else, was it really went into detail from a business point of view. What were the costs and what were the challenges, etc. Now, the document is something like 25, 30 pages long from memory, but what I've done here is tried to pull out some of the key words. So in the introduction to this document, it refers to GDPR as a complex regulation. It really does fail to specify technical solutions, and it involves subjectivity. So already kind of a nightmare from the outset. Then the key things are around compliance. It was expensive for companies to implement. It did mean bringing on an extra administration staff. It did mean employee training, and it was difficult to recruit people who were familiar enough with the legislation to provide guidance. I suppose a lot of people were relying on lawyers to a large degree. Retaining staff, because it started to bog things down a little bit. And this is still happening today. It did impact on some organizations' performance. And it also meant they had to cut back their service offering in the EU to avoid it. And you'll see a very similar thread here in a moment when we start to look at maybe what's happening here within the Australian market, at least. And I'm sure very similar potentially in the New Zealand market as well. So some key things to think about there: compliance, expensive, training people. These are things that we need to be aware of as marketing leaders. So lessons from GDPR, is it coming down south? Okay, so the key lessons that we extracted out of that whole GDPR exercise, with a big focus on that particular document, was that businesses are the custodians of their customers' data. We don't own the data. Now, this is probably not revelatory for you. I'm sure you get this. Consumers have rights over their data, how it's shared, and also the right to be forgotten was a fundamental piece of the GDPR as well. Businesses may need to prove opt-in details and comply with local legislation. So I can recall a conversation with a client here in Australia, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and their database was in the vicinity of 200,000 contacts. And CMO pulled me aside after we were doing some coaching, and she said, "Derek, I've got one group of contacts, about 30,000 contacts." She said, "I have no idea how they got into our system. I don't know if they've been there for 20 years and they've just moved from system to system to system." She said, but effectively, it's a group of 30,000 individuals that I technically really can't email. That's a challenge. And so we obviously want to be able to avoid that. And look, there's probably most of you on the call today, there's probably a little segment of your database that may also fall into that same bracket. Getting houses in order and maintaining them is a significant compliance investment. So yes, it's a discussion with the legal team, but it's also critical that we have IT on board and we have people within the marketing team who are savvy enough to understand how all these bits and pieces come together. So inaccurate opt-in data is too risky. Just delete the data or re-engagement campaigns. Okay, it's just way too risky. We might remember a few years ago, Woolworths got into a whole world of trouble. I kind of felt bad for them. They weren't using our platform. They were using another platform. And I honestly cannot even blame the platform, okay? It was just a misunderstanding in relation to the legislation. And it feels like Woolworths were probably just made a bit of a scapegoat and an example of. But it cost them $1 million, right? So it was a pretty extensive fine. So centralized first and zero-party data has to be the most trusted, and that's what we've seen in the European example, that they have gone back to that data that they own, not the list they've purchased and other bits and pieces, but the data they own and they've collected. That was the most trusted data. So that should be a focus for us moving forward. So what's already happening in Australia? Well, there's a number of things happening. There's an online privacy bill amendment before the Australian Parliament, which is being reviewed. And we've got some interesting comments from that here in a moment, which I'll share with you, which is from another one, which is the Privacy Act Review discussion paper. The other impact, which is non-governmental, but Apple, obviously from a technology point of view, the Apple Mail privacy changes. Now, if you're not an Apple user, you may not fully kind of understand the impact of this. For instance, when this all came into play, which I want to try to remember was September 21. Maybe anyone can jump in and correct me on that. Essentially, what I meant is if I turned my phone on after I updated to whichever iOS it was, and I was presented with a question and really basically asking me what I wanted to share, etc. Now, of course, being a marketer and a bit of a data whore, I said, no, that's fine. I'm happy to share everything. So I just want to have that full experience, right? But the other big impact really has been around those opens and whether or not they're real opens, etc. Now, that's a whole nother discussion, and we have blog posts you can read on our website, which will talk more about that in an eloquent context, at least. But they're the big things. Now, what's the discussion that's happening? Now, I don't expect you to read this completely, but going through the Privacy Act review discussion paper, it was really interesting to look, first of all, at the brands who had proactively responded. Telstra, we always like to use Telstra as an example, I suppose, for good or bad. And some of the key things I've tried to bold here is that their concern is the current proposed legislation is too prescriptive. It's less onerous. Will have unintended consequences. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound a bit like what's happening with GDPR? For them, one of the big challenges is around primary and secondary users and what that means. And that was part of the challenge that Woolworths got into with primary and secondary. So a single email account used by multiple people in the house, typical with a husband-wife type scenario, partners, etc. Unnecessary burden on entities, so meaning that you as a business are going to have these unnecessary burdens placed upon you. Significant time and resources. Again, it's really starting to sound a lot like the GDPR. And the thing is that they've said here at the last point, we consider the right to erasure may have many potential complications and is unnecessarily onerous on business. So that's similar to that right to be forgotten scenario. They even go so far to say that they may in fact just cease offering some services because to have it be compliant with the proposed legislation is just too hard. So this is from CARE, so that was a B2B scenario. I thought it'd be interesting also to look at it from a not-for-profit or a for-purpose industry. So several of the proposed amendments detailed in the Attorney General's Department Privacy Act discussion paper will definitely impact Care Australia's fundraising and marketing efforts, potentially risking crucial income we need to continue operating our programs across the region. So from a not-for-profit, that's an interesting position. Chad White is the head of strategic research at Oracle, and in the context of the Apple privacy, he sort of skips past, I suppose, all the privacy piece and really just gets to the point, I think, from a digital marketing point of view, and that is that opens will no longer be very helpful. And if opens have really been a strong indicator for you of campaign performance, then maybe we need to revisit those things. So he says the loss may have the beneficial effect of driving marketers to use deeper metrics like clicks and conversions that are much more closely aligned with business success. So 3 sort of points there that I think make some really interesting points. All right, let's jump back to you, Adrian. So data and privacy challenges faced by marketers today.
Ultimately, I think we're going to look at what's the impact on CX of all of this. So we already know that finding ways to deliver connected, personalized experiences is pretty hard, right? So in the context of this sort of evolving data and privacy landscape and seemingly continuous changes to rules and regulations, then those challenges just seem to multiply. I think even simple data pieces, like if we want to do onboarding journey for a new customer, and you've got to define a new customer, and are they really new, and when did they join, and when did they start, and I think it's even that level of data is can be difficult to manage, especially if you're talking about multiple divisions and multiple entities. So it does get complicated quickly. So and we're all striving to deliver this sort of customer-centric experience. And to be able to do that, we've got to understand needs and desires and challenges and their preferences, somebody's pain points. So that's really why that first-party data and getting that collated is so critical to marketing and success. And I think, the quote from Adweek kind of sums it up really in that you've got to build an ongoing first-party relationship through really good experiences. And that leads to customers offering their data in exchange. So it's this kind of reciprocal arrangement where, you're providing something, value, service, and in exchange, they're providing you with the data that you need to continue to tailor that experience moving forward. So I think we wanted to talk about really some of the some of those challenges and just dig into them in a little bit more detail. And then we'll go on and talk about, some of how we can plan for success in the context of this backdrop.
All righty. So we'll kill the slide deck. You'll notice we've got a slightly modified version here behind me. So hi, Andrew, and hi, Adrian. So we've got a range of questions here, and we're obviously keen to have those on the call. Also use the Q&A to throw some questions up. Andrew, if I could start with you. So how are you seeing CX expectations change in the market? You've been a student of this you were saying about the last 10 years, you've had a real key focus on this.
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting presentation because it really sort of touched on all the kind of key themes that have emerged over the last 10 years. Before we get to the evolution, I think the thing that's been constant across that period, and it really emerged with smart mobility, smartphones and Apple and Android, etc., was that customers these days very much sort of take their best experience in any context and apply it to every context. And it's incredibly unfair if you're a marketer, but unfortunately, it's the world we live in. We live in a world where consumers have been educated by some of these extraordinary service providers, particularly in that base world, to have these expectations. So at a very simple level, when I log into the bank, I just assume the bank will remember me if I'm going to buy another product from them. That's at a very kind of base capability. So that, I think, is kind of the benchmark or the world that we all live in. The other thing that's been happening, and you touched on it, and it's where you start getting into the paradox side of things, is the idea of personalisation. There's no doubt that people want personalised experiences, but there's a big argument over what that actually means. So on the one hand, a lot of the marketers that I've dealt with over the years view personalisation very much through the prism of messaging. So basically how they sort of get their campaign messages aligned, which is all about what's required by the brand. Customers tend to view personalisation through the sort of prism of, do you make it simple, fast and easy for me? And those things were actually a long way apart, really, until a couple of years ago. So those Gartner figures that you published about the 80% of the projects failing, they've sort of come back a bit on that lately. But that's largely because the definition, the way people are defining that has started to come together a bit more. So the sort of the marketing tech view and the marketer view is actually starting to become more closely aligned to the consumer view. The other point I'd make is that there has been this really big disconnect, I think, in that the marketing tech companies, particularly ad tech companies, and by extension the brands, have all convinced themselves over the last decade that consumers are along for the ride, that basically they could sort of have all this behavior, do all this stuff, have all this personalization and tracking, and the consumers were completely on board with it. And I think until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think consumers were hostile to it. I think consumers were just completely ignorant of what was going on. And I used to have these arguments all the time with the industry. We ended up running research where we asked, I think it was 1,000 consumers, about a dozen typical ad tech behaviors. And I know that this is probably more of a MarTech audience given the background, but the worst behaviors are in the ad tech world, trust me this. And we just ran through what were really normal behaviors that every second that you're on the internet happening. So retargeting, which is an absolutely normal, acceptable behavior. Even 2 years ago, retargeting was magic to consumers. They didn't quite understand how it was happening. And then you get deeper and deeper into it. One of the questions we asked, my favorite question out of the survey, is we asked the consumers what should happen to the directors of these companies that do these behaviors. And 25% of them said the directors should go to jail. Now, I don't think they should go to jail, but it does tell you that it shows you that there's a disconnect. And the other point you guys made, which I thought was really interesting, is there is now a much clearer consumer view around the value of the data that they've got and the impact of what they share. And I think that's something which is starting to play through. It really broke into consciousness. I guess 2017 was Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and all the rest of it, because you had this debate about data that normally would be restricted to the people on this webinar that suddenly broke into public consciousness around an issue that people were passionate about, which is their own, personal kind of political views, etc. So that's really kind of brought it to the fore. In all that, you've then got GDPR, which is the other issue you guys raised. I think the comment you guys made on GDPR, where I probably have a slightly different view. I don't think the question is GDPR coming? GDPR is already here for a lot of companies. Like if you're in the education sector, for instance, you're marketing to overseas consumers, you've got to be aware and alive to what those rules are overseas. So when it first came in, I think a lot of companies decided that GDPR would almost be Australian companies would almost be a kind of bedrock idea, that that was going to be the standard and everybody would apply for it. I think most of them worked out pretty quickly. That was a pretty expensive threshold to reach, but that was a kind of aspiration. And then, we're starting to see Australian law catch up. It is quite different. I thought those comments that you put up by the Telstra and some of the other folk was interesting, because that to me still felt a bit like the market's kidding itself a little bit in terms of where the consumers are. But the reality is we have to find a medium. Consumers want, there's a certain level of service that consumers want. The other point I make, and I think it was one of Adrian's points on personalisation, wasn't only made difficult by privacy law, it was made difficult by technology. It was just really hard to do. And so for a lot of organisations, the issue was basically, it wasn't even necessarily the tech, it was just the sheer pain of getting all those data silos aligned and working together, which frankly the marketing tech industry has been pretty good at. No, overall tech industry has been pretty good at. As people start to understand, you've got to get that data infrastructure layer sorted. So to me, they're the kind of things that stand out at the moment. I think the big trend that seems to be coming is just a lot more consumer control over the data. So there's an interesting project in New South Wales at the moment with the data, with the digital ID, where the goal, as I understand it, is that the government's digital ID will validate, yes, that is actually Derek. Okay, so if I'm a brand, I can be confident that that is Derek, but it'll be on Derek's determination whether he shares any information underneath that. So you can, from an identity management point of view, yep, I'll let him in, I'll put his accounts up, etc. But I won't necessarily know what his favourite football team is or how old he is. So I think that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Adrian, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that the significant change for me, I think, has been that idea of that awareness just driving more skepticism and mistrust. And I think that's just one thing you just have to be careful of. So I think, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you'd see unsubscribe just a little bit hidden or a little bit hard, or you might have to go to another site and fill in a whole bunch of stuff before you get to really opt out. And then people are like, that just reeks of kind of that mistrust now. And that's and so people want to see that transparency. They want that process to be easy as well. And so those sorts of things kind of, I think, count in the negative bucket. On the positive side of things, I think if you take data and you use it well, then people will share more. So I think little by little, you can earn more trust. And so, when Netflix wants to ask you about all your family names, you're probably okay with it because you go, yeah, that's fine. They're going to divide up my movies, which makes much more sense than me watching my kids' movies. But and so that does engender trust, and then you do share more. And I think that's think about it in a B2B context or in higher education, it's about asking for the right information at the right time and making it clear as to what you're going to use that information for, and then using it. So I think and show that you are using it. And I think then, the value exchange becomes more obvious.
Absolutely. So if we look at then omni-channel, not just, we live in a little email world, I suppose, with Eloqua sometimes and our Marketos and Salesforce marketing clouds, etc. But omni-channel, okay, the rules and regulations, what do we see potentially coming down the track that will help us, will hinder us, will help us deliver a better customer experience?
If I can jump in on that one first, I think there's a really interesting article, one of the Digital Nation, one of the publications I work with at the moment, was an interview with the chairman of one of the main sort of fashion retail groups. And what he was saying in that interview was basically that there's an expectation now. Consumers have an expectation around omni-channel. So they've moved into that world. And in some ways, they're often ahead of the capacity of the merchants to deliver, I think. So I think you don't really have a choice around that. The rules around how you actually sort of use the data to deliver that experience. I think what what the brands want at the end of the day is really kind of clear rules and guidance around what can be done. So we do need to evolve the rules and develop them, but we also need certainty around what can people. And I think the issue at the moment is you're worrying about GDPR over here, you're worrying about CCPA in California, if that's what it's called. There's, a slight mishmash in Australia when it comes to privacy law and responsibility and who's accountable. So I think that's the bit where I think business has a strong argument to make, which is we just give us a really clear sense of what it is that you want us to do. It's very clear, however, that from a user experience, that's where the world's going, particularly in an app-based world where we're all transacting on our phones. That's what we expect to be the experience.
Adrian.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really complicated trying to understand the legislation across different countries and regions. And when you start to think about omni-channel, thinking about trying to send an SMS message regionally, and all of a sudden you've got to get permission to do, the rules in New Zealand are different from the rules in India, so it becomes really complicated to start to put in place broad-based campaigns where you've assumed that you're going to be able to send a message of a certain type to a certain audience. It makes it really challenging when you've got different rules in different places. And I think, Andrew, you mentioned earlier, you've got companies that are, already dealing with GDPR, and so they're having to store the information about opt-in and when and how, so that they are GDPR compliant. So I think what ends up happening is you end up having to adopt the rules for the strictest legislation that you kind of know of, because that becomes your baseline for all of it. So if you're going to collect the date that somebody opted in and, specifically what form was it, then you might as well do that for everybody, because that's, you might need it down the track.
Also, just one last point on the omnichannel. I think it's a little bit like the personalisation thing where consumers have a clear view of what they mean around omnichannel, and it's very much based on experience, which is I moved from this to this to this. I shouldn't have to be putting in the same information all the time. You should remember what's happening. There's always the danger that marketing thinks of omnichannel in different ways. So I think if we kind of keep that idea, I'm a huge believer that you put user experience and customer experience at the heart of all your planning, and then everything kind of flows out from that basically.
We've got some discussion happening here in the Q&A, which is interesting. So Joni says, comment more than question. Sounds like Q&A, doesn't it? Comment more than question. This really puts the onus on us as marketers to also explain the benefit we are going to provide, the value add, so that when we ask for the data, it aligns with the value add the audience need, want, or expect. Great comment. Alice has then responded, says, it's based on trust, which means onus on marketers and brands to demonstrate that we are worthy of that trust.
I can just make a really interesting point somebody made to trust me at a different event about a year ago, which is trust isn't just that I trust you to keep my data safe or that I trust you to use the data in the way that I give it to you. The highest level of trust is I trust you to actually do really interesting things with the data that give me the experience I expect. Now, the example I'll give you is Amazon's quite good at, I don't know, it's a terrible threshold to put everyone to measure against, but if you pay too much for a product, Amazon's very good at saying you paid too much for the product, here's $4 back. That's the kind of thing consumers, that builds loyalty and trust with the consumer. And you can only do that because of the data that you hold on the customer. And so that to me is a great example of value exchange, which is I'm trusting you with the data, I'm trusting you to do the right thing. But in fact, you're going beyond that and you're actually giving me a level of service I didn't anticipate. That to me is where you want to kind of get to eventually. And very hard to do. So
yeah, definitely. So let's look at the changing landscape then. We've certainly seen the Apple privacy has been part of that more recently for us, but what else can we expect, Adrian? What are your observations there?
There's obviously this deprecation of third-party cookies, which is on the horizon. Although the horizon keeps getting pushed back, so there's obviously lots of implications to large businesses that are reliant on that. So I suspect what's happening in the background is that they're demanding some sort of alternative, and the alternative isn't providing all the things that it needs to in order to be able to satisfy those demands. So, but I do think that that is the clue to where this is going, and it's going to be more. You're going to be more and more dependent on your own data and your own trusted data rather than stuff that's collected by other people, maybe not with the full disclosure of what it was going to be used for in the first case. And also that concept, the hidden engagement, the hidden capture of data is going to be less and less tolerated moving forward. So that means, we've got to move to the front foot and go, this is why we're collecting, this is what we're doing, we're being transparent about it. It's a little bit like, it's like your terms and conditions in your financial arrangements, right? They're just becoming more and more transparent because they have to. You can't just have a hidden clause that you then say, oh yeah, we've had this in our, our terms and conditions for ages, but it was never pointed out very clearly. So I think it's that, and it's that same sort of process that's happening here. What it means is that we need to be also conscious of the knock-on effects of that. So what does it mean in the future when we want to do advertising? What does it mean in the future when we're running lead scores that are dependent on open rates that we now can't measure very clearly? So, that's where it's heading, which means we've got to think about, okay, we're going to have to depend more on actual engagement and click-throughs as opposed to open rates, because they're things that we can measure as opposed to things that are going to become, harder and harder to measure. So
I think I can just jump in there as well, just on the sort of first party, third party sort of split. In that research I mentioned earlier, one of the things we ask people is their level of comfort about how the data they provide is used. And unsurprisingly, the closer the data point is to the benefit that they get. So I give you my address so you can send me something. People are totally relaxed about that. The further the data point gets away from the utility, the more concerned and ultimately angry they get. And where they got most angry in that particular survey was when they provide information for one purpose and it would get used for political advertising. So the data would be, whether this happens, but one of the scenarios we gave was you give the company this data, they sell it to people who do political advertising. There was huge amounts of hostility. And I don't think it's politics. It was more about the fact that it was just not at all connected to what they were doing. So I think that's a really important lesson. And I think Adrian sort of touched on it before. You're kind of collecting data points as you go along because you're adding to the utility that you're providing to the customer.
Interesting. All right, so data value exchange, which kind of goes to Joni and Alice's discussion there, I think in the Q&A before. So how do we establish a clear and fair value exchange? How do we do that? Adrian, any ideas?
Yeah, look, the key thing is to provide something in return for the information or the data that you have. And I think it needs to be equitable. So if you're asking for, a lot of information or particularly personal information, then you need to have earned the right to collect that information or be very clear about how you're going to use it. Otherwise, people just won't provide that information. I remember going to a school careers day with my 16-year-old son, and he wanted to win the laptop that was on offer for filling in the form. And he got halfway through the form and he just said, it's too hard. There's too many questions. And he didn't bother. And I said to him, not many people will fill this form in. If you fill it in, you've got a good chance of winning. He said, no, I still can't be bothered. And it was just like, just when, just asking for too much. And it wasn't equitable. So I think that's what you got to have in your mind in terms of, kind of balancing out what you're asking for and what you're providing in return.
I can, at the risk of upsetting 99% of the audience members, I think the one thing that's really clear is that consumers don't regard personalized messaging as a value exchange. They don't regard being served ads as a value exchange. It's all about the customer utility. Now, I've personally lived through this as a media person. So I'm old enough to have been around in the late 90s when we switched from print to online. And while it might seem self-evident that I'm getting this extraordinary product called the Sydney Morning Herald with like millions of dollars worth of world-class journalism for free. And all they ask in return, they don't even ask you to give them information. They just ask to capture a cookie and send you an ad. The consumers see no value in that. So, but the reason that the newspapers have all moved to paid models is because they couldn't establish what, to my mind, is an incredibly clear value exchange. So I think a lot of the time it's about us, if we're brands, actually sitting back and going, okay, let's actually step outside of our own world view for a moment and just view this through the lens of the customer. How are they thinking about this? And I think we've sort of seen the emergence of design thinking and those kinds of things, and that's sort of come to the fore to help address these issues, I think. But it's hard. I don't have an answer. I don't know too many companies who do it brilliantly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in our B2B world, it's the oldest trick in the book has always been a piece of thought leadership, or something that's relevant, that's going to be helpful to the recipient who reads it. Then I come to a thought process where, is even sharing a 6-page PDF the best idea in the world? Because personally, when was the last time I sat down and read them? Well, I kind of do on the iPad when I'm going to and from work on the train, but maybe drip feeding that information to people is another way to do it. Explain to them up front. You can either, here you go, download it if you'd like, or if you like, maybe over the next 6 weeks, I can send you one email a week where we just tear apart one individual point and cover that off. So different ways of approaching sharing of the information. Be transparent up front with that mode of communication. So a range of ways. First party data opportunities. So given that we need some data to personalize, how do we prioritize what's important? Adrian, you and I do this all the time in relation to forms for today's webinar, for example, to whatever. There's always a prioritization that takes place, and it's usually underdriven by a marketing qualified lead. What do you need and the sales team need in order to pick up the phone or make contact with the person?
Yeah, well, to identify, somebody who might be buying or might be interested. And I think, I think the challenge here is that we've got limited opportunities to ask for data. So we have to be super clear about the data that's important, because if we go off and start collecting a piece of data and then we decide that we don't actually want that piece of data anymore, we're not going to use it, it's just a horrendous waste of an opportunity. So it's almost like going back and going, okay, let's really understand how we differentiating, or what is the data that we really need to present or to provide our services or value in the right context. So I don't know, take an example. Are we differentiating by industry? If we are, then let's collect the industry and be super clear about that and what people want to learn about. But if we're not, then let's collect something else instead. So I think having that understanding of the data that you need in order to be able to help either educate people or help them understand what you do or the value of your services, or help them move to the next stage or within that particular stage of their buyer's journey, is that it's having that strategy and having those data pieces in place. And once you're clear about it, then it could also be something that's collected like across an organization. It doesn't have to always be on a form. It's when if someone calls the call center, that's the piece of information that you ask for, so that you've got some coordination in that data collection and hygiene and maintenance, because these things don't stay static. They're things that change all the time. That then gives you the best opportunity to provide that personalization and relevance.
I think there was some ADLA guidelines, maybe about 3 years ago when they put out the guidelines, and I think the base proposition was only collect the data that you need to fulfill the order, and then build on it as you go forward. I mean, Derek's point before, I know the B2B world, I know much better than the B2C world. There's clearly an appetite for thought leadership content. In the world I'm in, which is digital and technology information for business, the buyers want information from the vendors because the vendors possess a lot of expertise. They just want it in a form that's useful to them, and they're willing to give up a base level information, and they're not dumb. They know what the information is being used for. So there is that thing where you can, so that's those sort of value exchanges I think work work really well. The trick is to, I guess, collect as you go along. The bit I don't know, and this is where my knowledge of things like GDPR and some of the privacy laws starts to run up against the cliff, is I'm pretty sure under GDPR there are rules that if you collect the data for this purpose, you can't use it for that purpose. And I think that's where it starts to get pretty complicated. And I have a lot of sympathy for brands that have to manage in those sort of arrangements.
Yeah, so we just really wanted to touch on some of these topics around what we can do today to plan for success in the future. And I think one of the things that that sort of resonated throughout our discussion so far is that trust and transparency. And it's easier to say, "I'll create a trustworthy brand," but people will share more information with you. But obviously there's so much that goes into creating a trustworthy brand. What we can say though is be super transparent about how you're going to use the data, have clear privacy statements, let people give people the opportunity to understand how you're going to use that, how you're going to use the data. And then, as Andrew mentioned, do it quickly so that people know that there's the reason that you've collected the data. There's kind of pretty quickly afterwards, they understand why you've used it. So yeah, I think that all helps. Another kind of one of my favorite kind of topics, I think, is this preference management. And it's something that's really changed from kind of an unsubscribe, opt out, just as somebody's about to end their relationship with you digitally for all time. You give them the opportunity to come back and, just one last chance type thing. We're sorry to see you go. But I think, that moving all of that to the front of your digital relationship and saying, how would you like us to communicate with you? What, tell us what you're interested in so that we can help. I think you can move that conversation really early in the relationship as part of an introduction, as opposed to part of a goodbye. And I think that is that helps then to really build that, set the scene, I guess, for that relationship as it's moving forward. And then establish kind of a fair value exchange in the data. So yeah, I think that's building trust and transparency is really important. I don't know, Andrew, if you had further thoughts around that.
Oh no, I think basically I always bring back to the utility. So basically you come at it from the perspective of what's the consumer sort of trying to get out of the transaction. Sometimes the consumer does want to hang around in the site for 5 or 6 minutes learning stuff. They just want to get in and get out quickly. So I think a lot of I think sometimes we over-engineer these things. I think, the more you can just sort of focus on how do I give the customer what they need as quickly as they need it and let them get on their way, particularly in a digital environment. I think that's really important.
Yeah. That personalization Netflix one, the Netflix emails just constantly amaze me. They'll arrive in my inbox and they're telling me, "We think you're going to like this movie, Derek." And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so going to like that movie. How do you know? Well, of course they know, because they watch everything I watch, right?
Yeah.
But it delights me as a consumer. I get nothing like that from Stan or Paramount, et cetera, Netflix, and I don't know why they're losing subscribers. It's beyond me. But yeah, hopefully they don't go away. So yeah, I certainly feel delighted after my Netflix email communications. Yeah, and then what will the future look like, I suppose? And we want to make sure we've got time here for Q&A. So we've answered the question. There's nothing sitting in the Q&A right now, but you must have questions or comments. Hopefully, for those of you who are on the line.
Well, how about the thing for questions? I'll jump in with one slightly out there coming in the future thing. So we're doing a lot of work over the last 6 months looking at Web3 and metaverses, and forget about the metaverse you go to, like a Decentraland or a Sandbox, if you're familiar with those. It's really about the amalgam of AR and the digital world and the opportunities that presents for messaging and data collection, all the rest. And most of that data collection won't be, it's not the kind of data the consumer is going to put in. So there's a huge debate starting to build up at the moment around how you kind of regulate that, because you can guarantee that if we don't regulate it early, it'll absolutely get abused the same way ad tech was abused in the early days, etc. So, imagine you've got two people walking down the street, both wearing a pair of Google glasses that aren't crap, basically. And the example somebody gave me is I'm walking down the road and I'm seeing all this political advertising for one political party, and I'm feeling good about the fact that my views are all being reinforced. But the person beside me is seeing political ads for completely different parties, and both of us actually believe everyone in the neighborhood agrees with us. So I'm not quite sure what the consumer version of that is. But you can imagine when you start getting into things like product placement, when you start getting into AR avatars that you meet at a virtual club and they start recommending a product and you don't know whether it's a real person recommending a product or an avatar. This is the far out 5-10 year stuff that people are just starting to worry about now, because like the data we're collecting now is nothing compared to the data we're collecting by the end of the decade.
Yeah. I think there's a great show. I think it's on Netflix called Up Life. I think it is. The premise being basically you've seen it, right? And so you don't die. Your consciousness gets uploaded into this virtual world, right? And it's hysterical to watch as a marketer, especially because you're walking around this beautiful location. These ads just. A wait staff will come up to you with, "Would you like some breath mints?" All these product placements along the way, and I'm just like, this. People will watch this and think it's all fiction, but I'm thinking this is not too far away. Perhaps it's quite interesting. Quite interesting.
Yeah. There's also in the technology side of things. There's also also this. Thin layer of in between, right, where you could do almost mass data exchange. So if I'm like you, Derek, and I want people to know, and this is what I want them to know, I'm going to let this platform know this information, and they can share it. I'm happy for them to share that this is what I like, and these are my preferences, so that I don't have to do it in sort of every individual form. And that's something that people will buy so that they can advertise to you. So there is a layer in between where technology is always going to play on that fringe and go, okay, well, I can't do that, but now I can do this. Well, we can set up a system and a technology to help deliver it, so that I can see everybody in this area that likes those types of things, or that typically does this, or and that sort of extension of that data exchange information. So I can definitely see that happening a lot more.
I'll tell you what, I'll finish with one data point that I came across on Friday. So we have a conference launching in Sydney. I won't go into the details of it here, but there's 4 different tribes of people who might come to it: IT people, marketing people, analytics people, and HR people. And everyone assumed that the IT guys would want to go to the IT stream, the marketing people would want to go to the marketing stream. And the first 15 people to sign up were all IT people, and all of them signed up for the marketing stream, which I thought, okay, well, maybe the system's broken. It's just defaulted that. But when I rang them up, the reason they gave the various variations of the theme was, when I go in a meeting with the boss, he never says to me, "How's the data lake?" He says, "Why doesn't the bloody marketing tech system or the CRM system, when's that going to be ready for me?" Because that's the stuff they care about. So it was a good reminder for me that we shouldn't make assumptions about our customers and what we want. Basically, we should read the data.
Yeah, really good point. Well, look, we're almost out of time. And so, Andrew, I should point out to people that you're coming to us live from your basement at home, because you've got 3 days left of isolation. You were meant to be on the Gold Coast and the Blue Mountains this week. So thank you for spending some time with us. We really appreciate your thoughts and your input. We'll have lots of information available after the session. It is being recorded, so we'll have a replay to you probably within a week. And we'll also have some other information and links that you can reach out to Andrew and find some of the other publications, etc., that he's got available that marketers would be interested in. And you probably already subscribed to, but we'll give you some links so you can get that information anyway. Thanks, Joni, for your input as well. So thank you very much. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you at the next Art of What's Possible. Thank you very much.